So, Matt and I were talking about this discussion I'm going to conduct today, and it seems that because of what Matt said, we have to do a little bit of a Matt Gasper's roast. And first of all, Matt, I can top you. I was at the actual Woodstock in 1969. And Matt, really, Metallica? What about the good stuff? The Allman Brothers. But Matt spoke about the state of the Novus Ordo system, and he also mentioned some of our Nicodemus friends. Matt, you mentioned Ed Penton as being a kind of a covert agent. I'll chalk this up to your youthful inexperience in covert operations, but you're really not supposed to reveal the name of the covert operative. When you blow his cover, he's no longer of any use to us. We'll overlook it. Again, it's a matter of youthful inexperience, But Matt spoke about red pilling and ending a delusion, and the delusion would consist of the state of affairs in what he called the Novus Ordo system. And since the theme of this conference is liturgical, what's the signal you're giving me? Mic down. The theme of the conference is liturgical. I want to situate the liturgical crisis in the context of this Novus Ordo system with reference to Pope Montini, Jacques Maritain, his mentor, and their relationship, curious though it may be, with none other than Saul Alinsky. But first, no one seems to have quoted this famous audience address of November 26, 1969, in which Pope Paul announced what he was going to do to the liturgy. And he says, and I quote, "We ask you to turn your minds once more to the liturgical innovation of the new rite of Mass, a new rite of the Mass, a change in a venerable tradition that has gone on for centuries. We must prepare for this many-sided inconvenience. It is the kind of upset caused by every novelty that breaks in on our habits. This is something that affects our hereditary religious patrimony, which seem to enjoy the privilege of being untouchable and settled. This novelty is no small thing. We should not let ourselves be surprised by the nature or even the nuisance of its exterior forms. As intelligent persons and conscientious faithful, we should find out as much as we can about this innovation." So much for the claim of certain defenders of the new Mass that it's really nothing new. He must have used the words novel and innovation 6 times in one paragraph. And then he goes on to talk about the novelty of it all. "It is here," he said, "that the greatest newness is going to be noticed, the newness of language. No longer Latin, but the spoken language will be the principal language of the Mass. The introduction of the vernacular will certainly be a great sacrifice for those who know the beauty, the power, and the expressive sacrality of Latin. We are parting with the speech of the Christian centuries. We are becoming like profane intruders in the literary preserve of sacred utterance. We will lose a great part of that stupendous and incomparable artistic and spiritual thing, the Gregorian chant. We have reason indeed for regret, reason almost for bewilderment. What can we put in the place of that language of the angels? We are giving up something of priceless worth. But why? What is more precious than these loftiest of our values? Actually, nothing. But here's his answer to his own questions. The answer will seem banal, prosaic, yet it is a good answer because it is human, because it is apostolic. Understanding of prayer is worth more than the silken garments in which it is royally dressed. Participation by the people is worth more, particularly participation by modern people, so fond of plain language, which is easily understood and converted into everyday speech." There you have it in a single phrase, the mentality of Paul VI, the appeal to modern people, whoever they are, as if people aren't always modern with respect to any given epoch. But the problem with the Second Vatican Council and the Novus Ordo system, as Matt has described it, is this fiction of the modern man who is somehow different from humans of previous generations, who has to be appealed to in a different way, who has to be listened to as the church accommodates herself to the spirit of the age. Now, this is what I have called elsewhere the thin modernist approach to innovation in the church. The thin modernist will insist this. Dogmas, of course, are unchanging, doctrines are unchanging. We must defend the deposit of faith, but we must do it in a way that is new and invigorating. A revival must be done in the language of the church so that the modern world can see at last the beauty of what the church has to offer. But nothing really will change. This will just be a different mode of Catholicism. This is contrasted with the thick modernist who goes after everything in the church, root and branch, including the dogmas of the faith. Now, one of the greatest influences on Pope Montini is the thin modernist icon, Jacques Maritain. You need to know a little bit about Montini to know why the two of them became such close collaborators. Montini was the product of liberal bourgeois parents. They were lovers of liberty in the Italy of the Risorgimento, in which the Papal States had been overthrown, and Italy was unified under a phony king in the name of the so-called unification of the Italian peninsula at long last. And these liberal parents of his were lovers of liberty. They were Italian patriots of the new nation state that had been created by force and violence with the aid of the usual cabal of Masonic revolutionaries. And as lovers of liberty, they were quite happy with what liberty had provided, as long as it included a house in the city and a house in the country, unaffected by all that violence and nastiness that those poor peasants had to endure when the revolution happened. And, of course, we know that Montini was born in the family's country house in Concesio, Italy, about an hour's drive from Brescia, which was their main base of operations. Now, in terms of the influence of Maritain, Pope Montini would later declare, being the good bourgeois liberal that he was, "I am a disciple of Maritain. I will call him my teacher." I think they met sometime around 1924, by which time Montini had been posted to Poland by the Vatican Secretary of State. He had already read Maritain's Introduction to Philosophy. Now, I'm not here to portray Maritain as an unvarnished villain. A lot of what he wrote is excellent. I'm not commenting here on his aesthetics, certain aspects of his Thomism. And if you want to read a wonderful diagnosis of the evils of Martin Luther's mentality, go read Maritain's description of Martin Luther. The problem we have with Maritain doesn't lie in those areas, and I'll get to the areas that are problematic in a moment. Now, in his three reformers in 1928, which includes the critique of Luther, the introduction was written by none other than Montini. And in the late 1930s, when Maritain's Integral Humanism, his masterwork supposedly, on this new vision of Christianity, was under attack, Montini was among the book's ardent defenders. The Maritain scholar Roberto Papini recounts how in 1957, Archbishop Montini, then the Archbishop of Milan, of course, received a letter from Maritain in which he was responding to the criticism of his so-called Christian humanism. And he wrote to the Pope that the atmosphere, meaning in Rome, has not changed. One lives always among great spiritual difficulties, but hope consoles us. This is the typical complaint of the thin modernist who's suffering under the terrible persecution of a pope like Pius XII, who was hostile to the Nouvelle Théologie of the French theologians, of which he was the leading light. And my focus is going to be on three aspects of Maritain's thought that had an influence on Pope Montini, not only him, but the Second Vatican Council, and the entire course of church history since the Council. These three things come under the heading of integral humanism. Well, what exactly is integral humanism? Like so many of the novelties that have afflicted the church during and after the council, it eludes a precise definition. But it certainly involves this idea of an integral human development that does not presuppose the conversion of souls to the Catholic faith, their incorporation into the church, and their translation from the fallen state to the state of grace, and therefore does not presuppose the continuity of the body politic with the mystical body of Christ. Integral humanism represents a major conceptual detour, I would call it a dead end, leading away from the divine commission to make disciples of all nations. Integral humanism departs, in short, from the church's authentic doctrine on the social kingship of Christ. In integral humanism, therefore, Maritain flatly declares that the unity of civilization that his new humanism contemplates, and I'm quoting him, would no longer be the unity of essence or constitution assured from above by the profession of the same faith and the same dogmas, but rather, he says, quote, a unity of orientation. Now, he never, so far as I can see, ever really explains the achievability of this mysterious unity of orientation. But that brings me to his political theory. For Maritain, the one vehicle for the socio-political embodiment of integral humanism is democratic pluralism. This followed his conversion. His earlier writings, up until the early 1920s, were pretty much in accord with the Church's social doctrine. He underwent, however, a conversion to democratic pluralism. His thinking became increasingly liberal, and by the time he wrote Integral Humanism, his vision had emerged, his vision of a new Christendom that really wouldn't be Christendom at all. His politics are described as Thomistic by his defenders, but the connection between his vaunted Thomism and his advocacy of individual rights and human dignity, according to the consensus of democratic majorities, unbound by the authority of the Church, is far from apparent to me. His attempts to link the two in various works seem to me cursory at best, if not outright misleading. Maritain cites St. Thomas for the rejection of what he calls, quote, a cumulative inertia of a backward scholasticism, which attached itself to accidental and perishable elements, end quote, meaning the elements of Christendom. All the elements of a Catholic confessional state that St. Thomas would be the first to defend as intrinsically necessary to embody the social reign of Christ over all nations. So let's look at three aspects of Maritain's political thought. His historicism, number one, his view of the source of political authority, number two, and his advocacy of a civic religion in place of the unity of one Lord, one faith, one baptism. First of all, his historicism. What is historicism? It's the notion that cultures and peoples are determined by the progress of history, as if history were a distinct and inexorable force that governs everything, so that with the passage of time, things must change just because history has advanced. According to Maritain and this thin modernist narrative that is now the official doctrine of the human element of the Church, any hope of recovering Christendom is gone. That must be abandoned in favor of a pluralistic democracy, which, contrary to Pope Leo, is not merely to be tolerated as a regrettable state of affairs, but must be now given moral content as the next divinely willed stage of human development. Back in the mid-30s, Maritain had expressed some irritation that young German Catholics objected to this dismissal of the Holy Empire as passé. But Maritain says it is not that the Sacrum Imperium was a bad thing. It is only that it is finished, his word. It's a word he imbues with the finality of some kind of irreversible physical event, like someone has dropped a wine glass on the floor and you can never put it back together again. It's finished, according to him. Now, he purported to detest Hegel, the philosopher who said that history is the outrolling of the world spirit, and the world spirit, in turn, is the development of God himself in this circular argument. He detested Hegel, so he claims, and he declares in Integral Humanism that people are, contrary to Hegel, radically free, and so forth. Nevertheless, he sounds very Hegelian in the same work because he speaks of a kind of law of history which has governed developments since the time the age of democratic revolution began. And he says in his book, Integral Humanism, and I quote, if it is true, and a Christian cannot fail to think it is true, that God governs history, that whatever the obstacles, he pursues history, certain designs, and that thus in time, through time, a divine work and divine preparations are achieved, it would be against God himself to wrestle with the supreme government of history, to claim to immobilize in a past form the ideal of a culture worthy of our action. So he eliminates here any distinction between the positive and the permissive will of God, and that leads inevitably to the conclusion, based on his own premise, that God positively willed the destruction of the so-called medieval Christendom through the work of religious and then philosophical subversives, followed by violence and bloodshed perpetrated against altar and throne by revolutionary fanatics, which is how it happened. But then what are we to say about these subversives and the bloody-handed revolutionaries? Were they the instruments of Maritain's, quote, divine work and divine preparations for the emergence of democratic pluralism? Are we to suppose that in working for the destruction of Catholic social order, the destroyers were not going against God himself or wrestling with the supreme government of history, to use Maritain's phrase? And furthermore, how does Maritain know that God, who governs history, does not have precisely in view a restoration of Catholic social order? Indeed, the very thing the Mother of God proclaimed at Fatima on the cusp of the period between the two world wars. By what channel does Maritain gain access to this outrolling of history in the mind of God? A distinctly Hegelian notion in the thought of one who, in integral humanism, claims to eschew both Marxist Hegelianism and historical materialism. A scholar by the name of Robert Song catches Maritain in the act of historical relativism. On what ground, he asks, besides pure historicism, which I just defined for you a moment ago, does Maritain stand to say that the restoration of so-called medieval Christendom is impossible merely because time has passed, while ignoring that the establishment of his ideal of a new Christendom is not only possible, but indeed morally incumbent? After all, he says, it might be wondered why there is a difference in kind rather than just a difference of degree between realizing the new Christendom and returning to the ideals of medieval civilization. After all, he says, it's very difficult to instantiate any kind of ideal in society, so who's he to say that one is more difficult to install than the other? And he asks the final question, what real argument does Maritain offer in support of his view that only his new Christendom is realizable today, whereas medieval Christendom is absolutely unrecoverable? And Song's conclusion, which is my conclusion, is no argument at all. It's merely because he says so. Secondly, let's look at his idea about political authority. Here, Maritain completely rejects the teaching of Leo XIII, which he once accepted, as far as I can see, in such encyclicals as De Eternum, which is in line with the Thomistic tradition, which says essentially that the authority of any ruler, be a king or a democratically elected representative, descends to him directly from God. The people may designate who receives the authority that descends from God, but they are not themselves the source of that authority. To quote Leo, the ruler is designated, but the rights of ruling are not thereby conferred, nor is the authority delegated to him, but the person by whom it is to be exercised is determined upon. In other words, we delegate the one who receives the divine authority to govern. This is not the same as the Protestant fallacy of the divine right of kings, where God selects a particular king and invests him with divine right, but rather the idea that our Lord expressed to Pilate himself, the very executioner who was going to put him to death, that he would have no authority over Christ if it did not come to him from above. And Leo says in the same encyclical that civil power bears the impress of majesty, not because it represents God. I'm sorry, I'm quoting Maritain here. Maritain, rejecting Leo, says that political power bears the impress of majesty, not because it represents God. It is because it represents the people, the whole multitude, and its common will to live together. He even denies the very concept of sovereignty, reducing the ruler to an image of the people. He specifically argues that by, and I'm quoting, investing rulers with authority, the people lose in no way possession of their right to self-government. He dismisses what he calls classical theories of political power, meaning the contrary teaching of the church. He says in a footnote that such a concept, the idea that authority descends directly from God to the designated ruler, remains in the background of some current scholastic views, which would reduce the democratic process only to a moment of free choice by the people of their masters, end quote. People have no masters, according to Maritain. The people are the master. But if the elected representatives are not masters, why must they be obeyed? Because, says Maritain, the people have agreed to obey them. So this is the nonsense of John Locke. The people are both rulers and subjects at one and the same time. The ruler is merely the vicar of the people. Now, Maritain even tinkers with the teaching of St. Paul in Romans 13, where he speaks of God's ministers, the ones who execute penalties, including the death penalty, as having their authority from God. This he invests with his own personal gloss on the gospel. He says that God's rulers are ministers only through the people, and this is, of course, nonsense when applied to the hereditary monarchies that predominated throughout most of Western history, and is in fact a warrant for overthrowing kings when they become unsatisfactory to a revolutionary minority who claim to represent the sovereign people. And in fact, echoing Locke, Maritain argued for the right to revolution. And here we encounter his idea of what he calls the prophetic shock minority. The people need prophets, says Maritain in Man and State, to move them in the right direction. They need, quote, inspired prophets of the people. And here Maritain reflects the influence of one of his own mentors, none other than Saul Alinsky, his dear friend, as we'll see in a moment, with whom he formed a friendship while teaching at Princeton in the late 40s and early 50s. In Man and State, Maritain gives these examples of prophetic shock minorities who wake up the sleeping masses. The fathers of the French Revolution, I'm quoting, or the American Constitution, of men like Tom Paine and Thomas Jefferson, and of course the originators of the Italian Risorgimento, which destroyed the Papal States and unified Italy, supposedly. He acknowledges that shock minorities can abuse their power to awaken the people, but they certainly need to be awakened. And he argues that the majority went wrong, but the shock minorities were right. The role of shock minorities, he says, is to, quote, awaken the people to something better than everyone's daily business, to the sense of a supra-individual task to be performed. The people are to be awakened, he says, because the people are asleep. People, as a rule, prefer to sleep. Awakenings are always bitter, end quote. Of course, inadvertently, he confirms what I've said in my book, which my church has for sale, by the way, that revolutions are never the work of the common people. They couldn't care less about the dreams of the prophetic shock minorities who wake them up. They want to till their land or sell their wares and live their workaday lives and die and get to heaven. But the shock minorities have other ideas in mind. And in the real world, the shock minorities engage in force and violence to get what they want. They stir up insurrection, they tear down existing structures, and they impose their will precisely as a shock minority in the most brutal fashion, and they don't refrain from genocide where it's necessary. And so the end result, again and again, in what we now call former Christendom, was the forcible replacement of monarchy with elective oligarchies who lorded over the people without any of the restraints that governed the kings of Christendom. In a democratic society, says Maritain, people play the part of the king. I like to tell a story in that regard. Maybe you've heard it. I'll tell it again, just in case some of you haven't. I was vacationing with the family, and I was at a retirement community playing some tennis with a bunch of retirees, and they were sitting around talking about their medical conditions, which is what we all do when we reach a certain age. And I decided to bring up the subject of politics during the Obama administration. I said, you know, we have a president. It costs about $1 billion to maintain him in the White House, and he goes on these multi-million-dollar vacations, and he rides around in this fantastic jet plane that costs billions of dollars to build and maintain, and he commands vast armies, and he has the power of life and death by way of presidential pardons, and he can destroy the entire world by giving a few simple commands to begin a nuclear war. And then I paused for dramatic effect and said, thank God we have no king, though. There was a stunned silence as something like the red pill approached them. Now, Maritain even manages to ignore his own admission in Man and State that the modern nation state has become, and I'm quoting him again, an earthly divinity whose absolute selfishness is sacred, and it has used political power to subvert any steady order among peoples, end quote. Yet somehow or other, Maritain never demonstrates any reason for confidence in his belief that this same entity could be converted to something resembling Christendom. That brings us to the third notion of Maritain's political thought, this idea of a civic religion. Maritain advocates, and this is the essence of the liberal Catholic project, to put the values of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution into a Christian framework of human personality, much the same as Thomas Aquinas had interpreted Aristotelian principles in a Christian way. That's a quote of Catherine McAuliffe in an article defending Maritain's politics. But the Aristotelian principles, incorporated by St. Thomas, unlike the values of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, were not contrary to faith and reason. And we have seen the results of Maritain's attempt. Indeed, we've seen the results of the whole conciliar and post-conciliar attempt to reconcile two irreconcilable systems. The values of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution destroy the Christian framework into which they were supposed to be fitted, just as the popes warned that they would. And that is why the syllabus of errors of Pope Pius IX, the victim of the Risorgimento in Italy, that Montini's parents were so fond of, that is why the syllabus of errors condemns precisely the so-called values of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Freedom of conscience, the separation of church and state, absolute freedom of opinion, civil marriages and divorces and so forth, the whole litany of the elements of the modern state system. Now, in place of the unity of faith in so-called medieval Christendom, Maritain proposes in Integral Humanism a nebulous, quote, common aspiration to the form of common life that is best in accord with the supratemporal interests of the person. Now, he rejects as a sheer fiction the idea of a common doctrinal minimum. This is what the thin modernist always does. He rejects the very thing he's going to advocate. He says, well, we can't have a common doctrinal minimum. But then a few paragraphs later, that's exactly what he's advocating. He says of this idea of this common creed, quote, by the very fact that it is secular, not sacral, this common work does not exact as a starting point that every man profess all Christian truths. On the contrary, it allows among its characteristics a pluralism which makes possible the convivium of Christians and non-Christians in the same body politic. Further on, he imagines a righteous ruler of some kind who somehow possesses the infused virtues of a Christian king without being a Christian. In short, he conjures up this idea, contrary to all historical experience that has gone before him, of a Christless Christendom. In this imaginary realm, he says, quote, the axiom that without Christ nothing firm or excellent can be built, even in the political order, applies here in all truth, not in the externally manifested and highly symbolized fashion, which was that of medieval civilization, nor in the apparent and decorative fashion, which was that of the classical age, but in a way which is real and vital, though less manifestly declared in the symbols of social life, end quote. He's dismissing all of the elements of Christendom as decorations. And he's proposing a Christendom that will not, to any appearances, actually be Christendom, but somehow will embody Christian values by the operation of his integral humanism. Now, to bring about this utopian dream, and this is precisely the dream of Pope Montini with his civilization of love, Maritain proposes in Chapter 5 of Man and State, listen to this, a common secular faith in the democratic charter, end quote, according to which, quote, even opposite metaphysical or religious outlooks can converge, not by virtue of any identity of doctrine, but by virtue of an analogical similitude of practical principles toward the same practical conclusions, end quote, so that everyone can, quote, share in the same practical secular faith, provided that they similarly revere, perhaps for quite different reasons, truth and intelligence, human dignity, freedom, brotherly love, and the absolute value of moral good, end quote. This is nothing more than the warmed-over prescription of the so-called modern Enlightenment. And the obvious problem is that without a common mooring in the law of the gospel, how can post-Christian men arrive at anything like a common agreed understanding on the meaning of truth, intelligence, human dignity, freedom, brotherly love, and moral absolutes? No common secular faith is even conceivable without an agreement on the meaning of the very words by which it is to be professed. It is not possible to negotiate with modernity in the language of rights and values while somehow sneaking into the resulting social compact the Christian recognition of their meaning and their origin. But that is exactly what Maritain is trying to do by his rhetorical sleight of hand. Now, even one of his contemporary defenders, Richard Shake, has put it this way: the result of what Maritain is talking about will be only a practical, not a theoretical or foundational agreement. And without a foundation in the divine and natural law, the danger of an eroding consensus is heightened. You think? Of course there's going to be an eroding consensus. There'll never be a consensus in the first place. The erosion and the collapse are inescapable. Yet Maritain goes on to imagine a, quote, civic or secular faith, not a religious one, end quote, that will unite the body politic. He even calls for the enforcement of this secular creed by the state as civic orthodoxy. In one of the essays in a compendium called The Range of Reason, here's what he writes: the heretic is the breaker of the common democratic beliefs and practices, the totalitarian, the one who denies freedom, his neighbor's freedom, and the dignity of the human person, and the moral power of law. We do not wish him to be burned or expelled from the city or outlawed or put in a concentration camp, but the democratic community should defend itself against him by keeping him out of its leadership through the power of a strong and informed public opinion, and even by handing him over to justice when his activity endangers the security of the state, end quote. And that is exactly the regime we see in operation today. We call it political correctness. We see people's lives being destroyed because they have the wrong opinions. We see prosecutions for hate crimes in various European nations and Canada coming soon to the United States based upon speech alone. And we see the tech giants censoring conservative viewpoints. So we have the democratic creed. It isn't the one Maritain envisioned, but it certainly is being enforced in the manner that he had in mind. Now, in reading all this crazy stuff, it occurred to me that there would need to be some kind of little red book, like Mao's little red book, for the inculcation of Maritain's democratic charter in the minds of the people. And after I thought of this, I stumbled across the observation by Philippe Chenot, a prominent Maritain scholar, that his magnum opus, Integral Humanism, was indeed, and I quote him, Le Petit Livre Rouge, the little red book of a whole generation of Christians. And this is what was leading up to the Second Vatican Council and its embrace of the modern notion of religious liberty. He echoes here with this democratic creed and its enforcement by the state, the very thinking of Rousseau, whom Maritain claimed to detest, and of Locke concerning the intolerance of Catholics and them alone in his letter concerning toleration. In fact, he seems to be more influenced by Locke and the American Constitution than by St. Thomas, who can hardly be enlisted as a source for this whole crazy notion. Now, Christopher Shannon has observed in his Reflections on America that Maritain, and I'm quoting him, came close to arguing that America had achieved the closest approximation of a Catholic social order, short of a confessional state. This conflation of Catholicism in America would bear bitter fruit in the next decade. The Second Vatican Council's call for dialogue with modernity was interpreted by American Catholics as an imprimatur on reshaping the institutional and doctrinal life of the church in conformity with secular modern culture. By 1968, the church in America, indeed in the wider Western world, appeared to be coming apart. And of course, we can relate that in large measure to the liturgical collapse, which was caused by the innovations in the liturgy that are the main theme of this conference. Now, Maritain, according to Peter Hebblethwaite, the biographer of Paul VI, was articulating the principles of post-fascism in Italy for Montini and those who would attend and preside over the council. But I say that in reality, he was articulating the terms of the church's unconditional surrender to democratic pluralism during and after the council. And if you don't think there has been an unconditional surrender, think for a moment about the American hierarchy. I need not say anything further, I think, on that score. Now, all in all, this shallow post-Enlightenment liberal politics of this supremely naive exponent of pluralist utopia, boils down to exactly what St. Pius X identified in his condemnation of the Sion movement in France. And I quote him, "Vague notions and ambiguous expressions with emotional and high-sounding words, which, whilst attractive, are nonetheless nefarious. Such were not so long ago the doctrines of the so-called philosophers of the 18th century, the doctrines of the revolution and liberalism, which have been so often condemned." And of course, it was all progressive pie in the sky. Maritain's entire vision was a delusion, the same one that has haunted our civilization since 1776. And yet Maritain imagined himself to be, get this, I'm quoting from one of his books, a kind of spring finder who presses his ear to the ground in order to hear the sound of hidden springs and of invisible germinations, end quote. I think the only hidden spring Maritain heard was the sound of his own babbling. Now, Maritain failed to recognize that in the mass democracies that are now the earthly divinities he himself decried, there has not only been a total loss of the distinction between church and state, but a merger of the two. The sacred secularity of the democratic regime is what we now confront. Indeed, as I showed you a moment ago, Maritain himself called for a civic or secular faith, not a religious one. That's a direct quote. William T. Cavanaugh has observed this about the development. The longing for true communion that Christians recognize at the heart of any truly common life is transferred onto the nation state. Civic virtue and the goods of common life do not simply disappear. As Augustine perceived, the earthly city flourishes by producing a distorted image of the heavenly city. Cavanaugh goes on to say famously, it's like being asked to die for the phone company. The temporal nation state of political modernity has supplanted the unifying and moralizing role of the church. And what is the result for the human person that Maritain, Montini, and the Council all exalt? John Locke, says the Italian political philosopher Danilo Castellano, reduces political society to the individual, and then he destroys the individual by subjugating him to the collective of the social compact. Maritain, and today the human element of the church, arrives at the same destination by exalting the human person, but the human person, socio-politically abstracted, no less than Locke abstracts the person from the collective of the church, which is no longer accorded public social efficacy, intermediate between the individual and the power of the state. The church cowers in its little corner in the public square. Now, I find it very mysterious that by the 1950s, Maritain's warmed-over version of the moderate Enlightenment, married to his version of Christian humanism, somehow managed to become the creed that influenced an entire generation of Catholic clergy and laity. There's a Maritain scholar by the name of Bernard Düring, quoting Eduardo Frei, who presents Maritain as the guru of a veritable worldwide cult at the time of the Second Vatican Council. Said Eduardo Frei, the future president of Chile, there is a, quote, secret affinity that exists among the disciples of Maritain throughout the world. And Frei, the future president of Chile, said this as well. The tremendous debt that Maritain's disciples owe to their master, he said, comes from his defining and clarifying ideas, without which their action would have lacked content and become no more than restless activism. What he says we must do is take the inestimable treasure of ideas that Maritain has left us and add to their richness by displaying them to the world and by revitalizing them through new and creative forms of interpretation. Just who are we dealing with here? Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas rolled into one? How did this man acquire such influence? When any student of political philosophy from a Catholic perspective would know, his political thought is that of a clumsy hack. That's what he really was in terms of his politics. Now, we see here an intellectual blindness that cannot have been the result of anything but what was at the bottom a hubristic and mysteriously unexamined presumption. And the presumption on the part of Maritain, Pope Montini, and other Catholic prophets of modernity during the period between the two wars and afterwards is that it was up to them to reimagine the entire relationship between church and civil society, as if no way forward would be apparent without their thoughts on the matter. Yes, if only the theological independent contractors of the Nouvelle Theologie could burn enough of the midnight oil, the church would have a vision at last of her proper place in the modern world. So Maritain thought himself entitled to propose to the church and the world what he calls, quote, the prospective image of a new Christendom. So evidently he viewed as inconceivable such quaint ideas as this one. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and she will be converted, end quote. So this is the figure that we're dealing with, whose influence on Father Montini and then Pope Montini would be absolutely decisive. In fact, the influence on the council, worked by Maritain and his works, was also decisive. Tracy Rowland says that Gaudium et Spes, one of the most problematical documents of the council, bears witness to Maritain's general political project of rapprochement with the liberal humanist tradition. Cardinal Gabriel Marie Garon, the relator for the commission that drafted Gaudium et Spes, revealed that Maritain's liturgical humanism was, quote, an important influence on the formulation of Gaudium et Spes. The document on religious liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, breathes the spirit of Maritainism. We see this immediately from its completely ridiculous opening line. Quote, a sense of the dignity of the human person has been impressing itself more and more deeply on the consciousness of contemporary man, and the demand is increasingly made that men should act on their own judgment, enjoying and making use of a responsible freedom, not driven by coercion, but motivated by a sense of dignity. Now, who in his right mind could say that about contemporary man after the bloodiest century in human history, the emergence of abortion and birth control, and the moral decomposition of all of Western civilization was already well underway? This is an absolutely delusional assessment of the capacities of so-called modern man, bereft of the guidance of the church. Now, Maritain didn't personally attend the council, but his theological collaborator, Father Charles Journet, did. He attended the last session in 1965, and Journet, made a cardinal by Montini, went right from father to cardinal, was very sound on moral theology, there's no question of that, but very liberal in terms of his social teaching and his politics. He was a member of the camp of Jacques Maritain. He embraced the thin modernist narrative of this illusory new Christendom. And during the council's final session, as one of the voices of Maritainism, he advocated Dignitatis Humanae and Nostra Aetate, the conciliar document on the rapprochement with various religions. And Maritain gave Montini 4 memoranda to use at the council. And these cover the following subjects: the liturgy, we can imagine what he said there, the apostolate of the laity, religious liberty, and prayer. Here's what he said about religious liberty in the memorandum he gave to Pope Montini. The state, he says, does not have any mission or any competence to teach the truth or to guide toward it. And for this reason, it does not have any power over souls or consciences. That is practically a transcript of John Locke in his essay and letter on toleration. He goes on to say, religious liberty must be proclaimed and guaranteed as one of the fundamental rights of the human person. Now, that may be the position of John Locke, but it was not the position of the Catholic Church before 1962. Overall, says Brooke Williams-Smith, while following the lead of Leo XIII, Maritain's social writings appeared to many before the council to be revolutionary. And Thomas Pink, a friend and colleague, has said this: Leo XIII's theology is proving more credible than Maritain's. For Leo's theology does what Maritain's fails to do, which is to explain convincingly just why political secularization has failed to take the benign form that Maritain predicted. What has followed political secularization is very much what Leonine doctrine implied might follow. Not at all what Maritain and Journet so confidently predicted. Now, before I get to the conclusion, I want to say a few words about the relationship between Maritain, Montini, and none other than Saul Alinsky. We can't leave the subject of Maritain without revealing his deep friendship with Alinsky, the cigar-chomping Jewish agnostic community organizer whom he met in 1945 during his wartime and post-war sojourn in America. Alinsky, Maritain would later write in his Peasant of Garonne, is, quote, a great friend of mine, a courageous and admirably staunch organizer of people's communities, and an anti-racist leader whose methods are as effective as they are unorthodox, end quote. In other words, political dirty tricks, of which Alinsky was the master. Alinsky saw a liberalized American Catholic Church, particularly in the Chancery in Chicago, as a prime vehicle for his advocacy of socialist programs, passed off as social justice, and of course he was right. Whenever Maritain and Alinsky met, writes During, they, quote, spent long hours exploring the democratic dream of people working out their own destiny. Both accepted democracy as the best form of government. In The Peasant of Garonne, Maritain writes this, I see in the Western world no more than 3 revolutionaries worthy of the name. Eduardo Frei in Chile, whom I've just mentioned, Saul Alinsky in America, and myself in France, who am not worth beans, since my call as a philosopher has obliterated my possibilities as an agitator. See, he's too busy providing the agitators with the philosophy they need. He can't do the agitation himself. So Alinsky's vaunted career as a social justice warrior in Chicago, as we know, as anyone who's studied his career will know, produced almost nothing in the way of actual justice. What he did, precisely at the urging of Maritain, produced a couple of influential books. One of these is Rules for Radicals, which Maritain either failed to read or decided to overlook much of its content because he praised this book to the heavens. Now, Rules for Radicals is dedicated in its preface to the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. In Rules for Radicals, Alinsky declares, dogma is the enemy of human freedom. Dogma must be watched for and apprehended at every turn and twist of the revolutionary movement. And after he denounces dogma, he lays down a series of dogmas. The sacred right to revolution. The dictum, and I quote, mankind has been as divided into 3 parts, the haves, the have-nots, and the have-a-little, the want-mores. The spiritual life of the haves, dogmatizes Alinsky, is merely, quote, a ritualistic justification of their possessions. And then he lays down various ethical rules for the social justice warrior, including the right to employ blackmail and other unethical means, if necessary, to achieve a so-called social justice result. And according to Alinsky's ethical rules, and I quote one of them, the real and only question regarding ethics of means and ends is, and always has been, does this particular end justify this particular means? Ethical standards, says Alinsky, must be elastic to stretch with the times. Here is an example of Alinsky's so-called moral purity, according to Maritain. I have always believed, he says, that birth control and abortion are personal rights to be exercised by the individual. If in my early days when I organized the back of the Yards neighborhood in Chicago, which was 95% Roman Catholic, I had tried to communicate this, even through the experience of the residents, that would have been the end of my relationship with the community. Some years later, after establishing solid relationships, I was free to talk about everything, including birth control. I remember discussing it with then Catholic Chancellor. By then, the argument was no longer limited to such questions as, how much longer do you think the Catholic Church can hang on to this archaic notion and still survive? And that was in 1966. Now, in spite of all this, here's what Maritain writes to his beloved friend Alinsky in 1971 about Rules for Radicals. Quote, a great book, admirably free, absolutely fearless, radically revolutionary. I regard the book as history-making. If middle-class people can be organized and develop a sense of and a will for the common good, and if Saul is there to inspire them, they are able to change the whole social scene for the sake of freedom. Now, he makes a few timid objections to Alinsky's amoral situation and utilitarian ethics. But at the end of the same letter, he says, "You know that I am with you with all my heart and soul. Pray for me, Saul, and God bless you. To you, the fervent admiration and abiding love of your old Jacques." Now, I'll note in passing that this relationship between Maritain and Alinsky gave rise to a connection between Alinsky and Montini. Maritain arranged a series of meetings in Milan between then Archbishop Montini and Saul Alinsky. There were 3 meetings in all. And we'll never know what happened during those meetings, but I can tell you one thing: Alinsky was delighted with the result. And here is what he said after meeting with the future Pope Paul VI, as arranged by Maritain. "No, I don't know who the next Pope will be," speaking of the conclave at which John the 23rd would be elected. "But if it is to be Montini, the drinks will be on me for years to come." Now, what did Alinsky know? What did he learn from his 3 wonderful meetings with Montini? He learned what Maritain already knew about his disciple. He knew that if and when Montini became Pope, there would be not only a liturgical revolution in the Church, but a thoroughgoing revolution. And it was Pope Montini who would declare after the council, and I quote, "The important words of the council are newness and updating. The word newness has been given to us as an order, as a program," end quote. I would say that never in the history of the Church has a Pope uttered such nonsense in a public address to the Church Universal. Now, I'll conclude with a section on what I call Montini's and Maritain's season of regret. They both lived to see their illusions shattered, although they refused to admit that their own thinking had been largely responsible for the situation that developed. They defended the council till the end, even as they lamented the results of the council. So we have Maritain regretting the rise of a form of modernism, and let me leap ahead to that quote. "The kind of throwing of the reins of the horse's back by John the 23rd was absolutely necessary. But what a risk at the same time. All that is professionally intellectual, professors, universities, seminaries, seem to me either spoiled or in a very dangerous position. A certain exegesis has gone mad and become stupid. There is a new modernism, full of pride and obstreperousness, that seems to me more dangerous than that of Pius X's time. It was, after all, a rather strange spectacle," he says, "to see all the bishops of the council, the teaching of the Church, each one flanked by his experts, professors, scholars, and pedants of the taught Church, of whom a good number were off their intellectual rails, and of whom almost none had any wisdom. So it is in the middle of all this hubbub that the work of the Holy Spirit is carried out." You see what he's trying to do here? He's trying to say, yes, there's a disaster, but in the midst of this hubbub, the Holy Spirit has prevailed. But no, it hadn't. There was a complete collapse of faith and discipline underway almost immediately after the council, and the situation had become so desperate that Maritain ended up suggesting, along with Cardinal Journet, that Pope Paul VI immediately promulgate a credo of the people of God restating the fundamental truths of our religion. Now, wait a minute. Wasn't the Second Vatican Council supposed to be the breath of fresh air that would finally express in terms that modern man could appreciate with great simplicity and clarity and beauty and joy all of the truths of the faith, so that modern man would at last now understand and embrace what the Church had to offer? Instead, we find this desperate rearguard action where the Pope has to promulgate the dogmas of the faith in an emergency broadcast, as it were, to remind people of what the Church teaches. And who wrote this document? At Paul VI's suggestion, Maritain wrote it. We have the Roman pontiff in the midst of a tossing sea, the modernist tempest that he himself had unleashed, begging his lay mentor to create a credo for him to recite to the people of God. And in fact, that is exactly what Maritain did. Paul VI adopted it almost without emendations. And the reason Maritain knew that it was his is that he read it in the newspaper and said, hey, that's my document. The irony is exquisite, isn't it? That it all came down to this. And now we're supposed to credit Paul VI for the credo of the people of God, which is a remedy, a belated remedy, too little, too late, for the disaster that he himself had unleashed. So, this is the Novus Ordo system, of which the liturgical reform was a major element. We know that Cardinal Ratzinger has said that he was convinced that the crisis of faith in which we find ourselves is due in great part to the collapse of the liturgy. And what's the solution to it? Well, we have the story that Matt told about his own life. The grace of God is the solution to it. If Matt can go from Metallica to the Latin Mass, so can every Catholic. Humanly speaking, there's no answer. But with God's grace and the passage of time, the situation will eventually remedy itself. It's probably at this point going to involve a very dramatic divine intervention. And that will involve nothing other than the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. The restoration is inevitable. It will happen. Matt tells us that the young people want tradition. The Holy Ghost is working in history, but the Holy Ghost is not history. God is the Lord of history. He can reverse any historical trend he chooses to. Civilization has collapsed and been rebuilt on Catholic foundations before, and it will happen again. We needn't lose hope in that regard, although in the meantime we have to proclaim the truth and awaken as many people, red pill them, with conferences like that. But in the end, the resolution of this crisis in our epoch, which has no parallel in church history, the resolution of that crisis is going to be left to the intervention of the lady to my left. Thank you.